Hello everyone, I'm Josh Kess, and I'm going to be showing everybody a project I've been working on, this specific oracle deck, or study deck, or tarot deck of gods from mythologies around the world, synthesized and syncretized into 72 deity cards that are meant to resemble statues that could work into a pagan practice or fit into any regular tarot reading. And if that Kickstarter succeeds, it will go on to our Etsy shop like all the others. I said I've been producing this deck for 6 months, but I've really been studying mythology, correlating different archetypes of deities for over 10 years, really. The Altar Oracle is like my magnum opus. Not only is there so much work poured into the cards and the art themselves, but also in the booklet there will be quite extensive research, since this deck is so close to being launched on Kickstarter, and I've basically finished it. I wanted to take a little detour from the regular videos and just talk about this project and break down just 12 of the 72 deity cards. Future editor Josh and Taters are here to tell you that I ended up splitting up this video. So this particular video is going to be Aries, and then I'm going to continue on with Taurus, then Gemini, and so on. This is the day of the Kickstarter launch. And there's a link in the description to go support me on Kickstarter. There are 12 core Zodiac signs and 12 cusp Zodiac signs, and there's 3 deities per sign, so that's 24 times 3 equals 72. So here's the art. On the left you'll see is actually about where the card would be. This is a demonstration of the incredible ability that we now have to generate backgrounds and even details in imagery using AI stuff. In this case, generative fill from Photoshop. I was able to take the card and expand out to the entire space and generated this beautiful backdrop. I chose between a bunch of different ones and tweaked up a little bit of it to make it look right. We could animate these. We can have his eyes blink, we can have parts of his arms move, we can have this grass move. There's actually a video on my YouTube channel where we experimented with animation using AI art. But it showcases the potential of creating an entire world, in that case, a sea temple. Starting with Aries, we have LAZAROS. It's taken from a Christian character who was resurrected by Jesus. Azael or Azazel, a fallen angel, is something of an evil demon, may have related to Aziz, who's an old Arabian red horseman of war and travel. He protected caravans. And Azazel refers to a desolate place where a scapegoat was sent into the wild to essentially bear the sins of the people upon them. And so there is this motif of sacrifice. Tammuz and Dumuzid are Semitic shepherd gods. Dumuzid was chosen by Ishtar or Inanna to be her husband, and this relates in some ways to the Jewish story of Cain and Abel, since God holds a sort of contest between the two brothers where each presents him with a offering from their trade, Cain being the farmer and Abel being the shepherd. Now Dumuzid is not explicitly said to have a brother. He actually has a sister, Geshtinana, who is an agriculture deity, but he nonetheless ends up dying tragically. And Inanna is so distraught by this that she descends to the underworld in order to get him back. This story also relates to Adonis and Aphrodite. Adonis being related to Adon and Adonai in Canaanite and Hebrew mythology, although there are many different deities that syncretized into the Judeo-Christian god. Adonis in the Greek story is also a beautiful shepherd who is chosen by Aphrodite to be her husband, and he tragically dies, and she along with Persephone, attempts to revive him. And that story, to me, also connects him with Aries, since Aries is the secret lover of Aphrodite. And it is said the very few times when Aphrodite and Aries are with one another that the world is a peaceful and harmonious place. Aries is away from war and channels his passions in a more healthy and humane way. To me, it is therefore interesting to kind of syncretize Aries and Adonis. Now, Aries and Mars are war gods, right? And as I've said in a few of my other videos, war gods are often, in my system, associated with Aries. But something I wanted to do in the Pandemonic Pantheon is go beyond war and get into the heroism and the protective capacity that a war god might represent. The ram which protects the flock. When we look at Martyr or Amuru, who was the Amorite or Babylonian war god, we find the idea of a shepherd and ram symbology. They were a Semitic people that seems to have originated in Canaan and migrated down into Sumer and conquered it. The Akkadians before them were also a Semitic people from the upper Euphrates that came down and was enslaved by the Sumerians and then rebelled and overthrew and created an empire over the Sumerians before falling to the Gutians. But the Amorites come to establish Babylon. I believe they take over a temple and build the whole city of Babylon around it. The god of these Semitic people largely appears to have been this shepherd war god combo. And we see this also evidenced in Amun of the Egyptian pantheon and Baal Hamon of later Punic or Carthaginian, which is really Phoenician pantheon. Also a Semitic people, also from Canaan. And where Amun gets to the Egyptians is probably through the Hyksos dynasty. Hyksos meaning shepherd kings. It's at that time that the cult of Amun-Ra spread throughout Egypt. In that case, Amun being syncretized with Ra really represents Ra essentially signing off on or consenting to his rule. Because Ra essentially in Egypt has always represented the crown. He is the sun god, and the sun is the crown. Ra, Osiris, and Horus were all considered to be aspects of Ra, the sun god, because they were all king. But this doesn't, in my system, mean that they're all the same deity. Rather, Amun is essentially just a later phase after Osiris and Horus. So Amun and Martu, being the shepherd gods, eventually kind of merged with these nearby ideas of like Baal and the thunder gods. And that's where there's something of a conflation between Zeus and Ammon, for instance, later in the Ptolemaic period. And some of these migrations might have been due to climate change. For instance, in the old record, the old biblical account of Joseph and all of his brothers, sons of Jacob, coming out of Canaan and migrating into Egypt in order to escape their famine, is likely a historical reference. The rough estimate of time where, say, Joseph would have lived roughly coincides with a period just before the Hyksos dynasty of Canaanites conquered Lower Egypt. Really what that's saying to me is that pastoralists and shepherds encountered difficulties and infertility in the land and a lack of rain. And so this deity came along to represent migration and conquest of other lands for better pastures, and also weather and rain and fertility more generally as well. The idea that a shepherd coming upon hard times and in needing to defend his people and his flock would only then go to war, right? More of a Hector mentality rather than an Achilles mentality. You know, Hector of the Trojans defended his city and his people and his family from the invading conquerors of the Greeks, the Mycenaeans, Achilles being one of them, who was just a selfish, individualistic person who just wanted glory and power and didn't really think about what he was fighting for. And I always felt that a lot of the Aries motif and the Martian motif is very Achilles and not enough Hector. So this, I think, bridges something of that gap in that attitude. Another huge influence with this deity would be Tyr, who's the Norse war god who sacrificed his hand in order to wrestle Fenrir to be captured and brought to the underworld, you know, no longer wreaking havoc on people and, you know, their sheep. In my mythology, there's another card in here that I won't get into in this presentation, which represents a wolf-like trickster deity that is common throughout many mythologies around the world. His rival is essentially this trickster wolf deity who is trying to steal his sheep, thieve, and outmaneuver and outthink him in a story of the shepherd and the wolf, right? Another very similar deity to Tyr is Nuada Ergetlem, Silverhand. And I see in the depiction I did here, I tried to make sure his hand here, his right hand, was silver, glossy, artificial looking because he lost it and he had it rebuilt. And this is a motif throughout many myths. We see it in Star Wars, like very heavily sacrificing a piece of yourself when you're on your journey. You know, Luke loses his hand, Anakin loses his hand. And I see a lot of that really Anakin mentality here with Aries. There's potential for great disaster and Achilles and, you know, being the hero and being the best. And then there's the huge potential of being Hector and protecting your family, protecting your people, trying to bring about peace and justice for your new empire, right? He could have been so much more and so much greater. He could have been the highest ideal, but he settled for the lowest ideal of Aries, the lowest war god ideal. That's why here also I don't say war god of protection, war and heroism, or shepherdry and heroism. I said the shepherd god of protection. Sometimes war, if it's necessary. I think there's a tendency these days with all these superhero movies to take that Achilles and even that Hector mentality and just overdo it. Like, there's a lot of press on this particular archetype. The hero's journey, even, the monomyth, as it's said by Campbell, he never meant for it to be a monomyth in the sense that it's the only myth in existence. There are many different monomyths in existence that are very similar to other myths, but are not the same story. This story of triumphing over evil or protecting a group of people or, you know, anything involving conflict and strength and war in that sense, which is most of the media that we're fed in Hollywood these days. That's just one story. You know, not everything revolves around fighting and punching somebody and defeating evil people, right? Despite that, I still find this a very interesting and deep and meaningful archetype. So Nuada was a hero, one of the first kings of the Tuatha De Danann, who, fighting in a war, lost his arm, and there's a tradition with the Tuatha De Danann that if you're king, you had to basically be physically perfect. So having his arm decapitated, it made him unfit to rule, and he was replaced by a young, beautiful new king, Bress, who was put in place by Balor, who is the evil eye, actually some of the basis of Sauron to some degree in Lord of the Rings. So in that, there's almost something of like a beautiful form of Sauron who's like trying to take over the kingdom. Nuada works with the craftsman, I believe, to craft him a new arm or a new hand of silver. In so doing, he takes back the kingship, and then there's a civil war between them and the Fomorians of Bress and Balor. So in that story, it doesn't involve a wolf per se, it's just a regular war, but there's still this idea of sacrificing and having to redeem oneself and prove oneself a warrior regardless. I wanted to bring up Hachiman in here of the Japanese traditions because he ultimately became a war god to the Bushido samurai tradition. And Bushido is essentially a Shinto Buddhist, sort of martial Shinto Buddhist sect from Japan that was worshipped, or the practice or the tradition of samurai largely. Hachiman kind of identified the perfect samurai. But something really interesting about him and nuanced about him is that before this martial samurai Buddhist tradition came in, he might have actually been something of a rural, agricultural, or possibly even shepherd deity. A deity that was masculine, but without needing to go to war in order to prove its masculinity. This later Buddhist martial idea put armor all over him. It's something that's kind of interesting in The Last Samurai movie, which I very much enjoy, that showcases the samurai in a more nuanced manner, where they're also devoted to the perfection of many arts and farming, and sure, they pursue military perfection, but they also live upon the land and by the land. That's another aspect of this motif that, again, in line with the Hectors and the Demusids and such. Essentially, like, stereotypically the perfect man, right? So another deity I put in here I wanted to mention is Teutates. And Teutates, kind of namesake of the Teutons, might have also been one of the main gods of the Anglians from originally Denmark, who then became Anglo-Saxon English. Teutates is considered and integrated into Celtic pantheons around Germany and France and Britain, as well as Germanic ones around the Rhine River. He's essentially a god of unification and of the people. To some extent, the name Tuatha De Danann, which means the people of Danann, Danann being Danu, a goddess that I will mention actually when we get to Cancer. Tuatha, in that meaning people, kind of relates to this Teutates. He's a god of the tribes. He's of communication, organization, as well as war. So more nuanced than simply a war god, like, say, the Teutonic Knights essentially represented much later in the medieval era to some extent. Not to say that those are the same people, per se. Another linguistic interest here is Teutates represents the quintessential tutelary god. Like, literally the word tutelary relates to a specific place or people or tribe is protected by this deity. And Teutates, like Lazarus here, I thought could represent all people, every tribe, every group, every locality. Every culture has their war gods, and every culture is praying to their war god against the other war god, right? What's interesting is they're all basically praying to the same motif, to the same idea. And if we were to look at it that way and see that they're all fighting for the same thing and relate to each other in that way, maybe we would have a lot less fighting in the world. And the last little reference I'm going to make to Chrysobalos, who is the ram of the Aries constellation. He's the ram whose hide became the golden fleece because he was a golden ram. And he was not only gold literally in the Greek myth, but he was also gold spiritually because he was a hero who saved the twins Phrixus and Heli from their conniving stepmother who sought to drown them in the sea. Took both of them from there and flew them to the other side of the Black Sea, to Georgia, to Colchis, which is how the Golden Fleece got there later, when in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, they go to retrieve it. When Phrixus sacrifices the golden ram in thanks to the gods for rescuing him, he is sent to the heavens, to Zeus in that sense, to become the constellation of Aries. And I thought I would bring that in there because that just quintessentially represents this heroism that I'm getting at. And with that, I think I could probably move on to the next one. I'd like to refer back to what Studio Pandemonium means to me and to Callie as co-founders of this small Etsy business. By Pandemonia, we're referring to Pandemonium. In John Milton's Paradise Lost, the main character, Lucifer, leads a council in the underworld of all of the spirits and daemons and deities and gods that have been banished to hell from the Abrahamic faiths. And he's meant to lead a revolution where these pagan gods are released once more into our world, showcasing the polytheistic variety of human thought and art and experience. So one thing that we're always trying to do in Studio Pandemonia is express, synthesize, integrate, syncretize various ideas from various cultures into a holistic worldview. By releasing all of the demons or daemons, recognizing them as not demons, but aspects of ourselves that we have repressed for a long time, then integrating that into a future worldview that is more holistic, more accepting, more nuanced. And this perspective to me is not purely, let's say, pagan or theistic or satanic. It's humanistic. Technically, I am an atheist. I don't believe in a god or any gods that are real in any physical or even afterlife type of sense. But regardless, I can find a way of practicing and understanding and representing and even channeling or living by certain virtues, motifs, archetypes that are inspiring or that are profoundly human. So that's essentially what this deck means to me. It means liberating all of these ideas and archetypes and expressing them through art. In this case, AI art. I used a combination of Midjourney and Photoshop's new generative fill features to kind of just go crazy on depicting deities that I have been researching for so long. It's so satisfying as a researcher and a graphic designer to be able to plug in ideas, environments, and styles and colors, and to describe a scene that has so many mythical undertones. There was actually a time where I was preparing to do this kind of deck for my research. It was always something of an ultimate goal to make an oracle deck of all these deities. I have some preliminary sketches of a few deities that I was working on. But when I saw the potential of AI generation, I started to experiment with it. And I started to find my language, my art style. Ultimately, I settled on a sort of statue aesthetic, making the deities look a bit uncanny, like intentionally, but not like so much AI art is just fantasy. It's like showing deities as being almost human or alive or powerful and just existing. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to show them as statues in potentially our own world, set up, built, and constructed in various locations. I wanted to portray them in a way that it felt like we could do that, like we could make them real, that we could bring them back, that we could create new statues and new shrines and new temples for a more global pan-human pantheon.